All right. So Dean asked me to come talk to you guys a little bit about the future of entertainment. And he said, it's going to be great. Let's talk about the next 50 years. You have 10 minutes to do it. So I flew in from New York last night. It's going to be that kind of pace. I have 35 slides, and it's not enough minutes. I would like to see my slides. Here. No stress. All right, so my name is Joost, pronounced like toast. I'm a CEO of a company that has now 35 of the smartest games industry analysts. We just raised a round of funding, and it's been an honor and a privilege always to work in the fascinating industries. We believe because it's not just about gamers in the universe, it's because gamers are sort of the consumers of the future, right? So whatever they do today, you see 2, 3, 5 years later down the line, you see more broadly spread. And then sort of on the side as a fun thing to do for me, I also teach at Stern. I have 60 undergraduate students who give me a lot harder time than many a boardroom member or any kind of investor when it comes to talking about any type of games. Fortnite, turns out I know nothing about them. They know everything. It's a really fun sort of interaction. So those are my two hats. That second hat, all you need to know is that I'm a recovering academic, which is why we're always strapped for time. So the sort of thing that I want to sort of take away, and I'll start there for today for me, is this idea that we're not just making better games only. I think games emerge from a really sort of solid vision of what an organization should be like. So a more recent example, or a recent example of companies that don't do very well is toy companies. They have a hard time adjusting to the new realities of how people consume, learn about, and spend their time and money on entertainment. So fidget spinners are a toy that no one saw coming, that no one owns. There's no patent. Anybody can make it and sell it, which is very troublesome if you're in the retail business. So in other words, where for most of us, we will say, well, the reason retail is dying, it's because Amazon is killing everybody and sucking the life out of the ecosystem. It's really, a debt-burdened company that doesn't have the wherewithal to figure out that here is a toy that's totally disruptive, that is not beholden to a 2 to 3 year development cycle where you have to plan your marketing that far in advance with massive inventory expenses and so on, and no control over social media and marketing. Those are the kind of things that will happen when a company like this dies. And so, this sort of image, I'm not from the US, but a lot of Americans tend to wince at this idea of like, oh, well, Toys R Us is dead now. It used to be this thing where I went as a kid. This is what it looks like when a company doesn't adapt to the changes in an ecosystem. So that's toys. That's sort of a parallel universe. Maybe we're a little safer from that here. The question then on the board for me today is how is the future of entertainment shaping up? And the first step there is how is the entertainment looking today, the industry specifically? In short order, things are going well. If you look at the last 30, 40 years of spending, in terms of consumer revenue for each of the major categories in entertainment, we're looking at $200 billion. It's going up consistently. And you see a few of those data points where the introduction and popularization of broadband and massive bandwidth for average consumers, as well as smartphone technology, had a interesting effect, to say the least, on some of those categories. If we break it out over those last 10 years, specifically, we see a bit of a change of the guard. Cable TV and broadcast TV still doing fine, although broadcast TV arguably, and I'll speak to this more in a second, is having a little bit difficulty with its sponsors and advertisers, but particularly newspapers, radio, magazines, those are all sort of, they're sort of legacy media that have to really figure out where they stand from here. So if we organize those categories in, sort of the way that we consume them, we watch them, we read them, we play, we listen to them, we end up with something like this. You see music almost at the end coming back up again. There's a lot of reasons for that. One of them is performance rights. So the industry model in the music industry has shifted dramatically. When it comes to average radio, terrestrial radio, Spotify, of course, those are sort of innovating that whole model. Watching media and entertainment is sort of pretty much steady and stable. We see Netflix, we see HBO. Those type of initiatives, those type of disruptors really are maintaining growth and a steady click. But reading is really the tough one, right? So New York Times recently reported that they are now making more money off of their subscription, their digital subscription specifically, than they were traditionally doing off of their advertising. They're taking their model that they traditionally held and turn it upside down. And then gaming, of course, has been growing pretty well over the years as well. So, here's a slightly different graph saying the same thing. You see a dramatic shift in how consumers consume entertainment. So the larger ecosystem that we all live in, of course, has everything to do with the massive sponsors and advertisers out there. Procter & Gamble is cutting back very aggressively on all of its agency expenses, saying, well, look, we spent less and we had the same effect. So what's going on? At the same time, Facebook and Google are taking over most of the expenses. So the ecosystem is sort of confronting a different allocation of advertising revenue. More so, a lot of the advertising out there is really, in a nutshell, tone deaf when it comes to reaching younger consumers. And then, of course, the obvious answer to all of this, if you're in the traditional media business, is like, well, let's all bunch up and let's buy everything and do economies of scale. This has been, this is a cycle. I've been studying this over the last 25 years now. As the industry, as the economics start making sense, media firms tend to consolidate. They feel that economies of scale are there. That may have been in a world where you have natural barriers to entry in a local market where broadcast towers only reach so far or where inventory can only ship so far. In a digital world, this is very different, of course, but you start to see those efforts and initiatives. And then finally, of course, on top of that, so here's an example of Sinclair Broadcasting, basically making all of its news anchors distribute and read off the same information across all of its channels. Here is an example of, regardless of your political agenda, here is, where's the regulatory dimension here, where's the FCC in saying, hey, you know what, is this vertical integration, horizontal integration, and how do we deal with that from a digital point of view? These are not questions easily answered, but this is the reality of the current media and entertainment landscape. And of course, I don't need to tell you too much about this. Busy day for Mark today. But most importantly, I think, is to remember that we are confronted by a lot of new opportunity and a lot of new things that we didn't have access to before. Here is a very unorthodox financial release, I say, stock market listing, valuing the company at $29.5 billion. This came out of nowhere. Of course, its economics are under heavy scrutiny now. Who's getting paid when we subscribe to this? And how do the labels fit in? And are they going to ask for more down the line? It's a very complicated world. But suffice to say that, in spite of it all, you would argue, things are going well. And it has everything to do with, increased agility and very much so business model innovation. OK, so that's sort of the landscape. With 3 minutes left on the clock, what are the drivers of change? Where do we go from here? So for the games industry specifically, I can think of 3 that really matter in this context. First of all, last year, Pokemon Go. This wasn't just a great moment in terms of, we get to relive Pokemon because we all love that and we grew up with it. It had everything to do with this game allowing games, mobile games, and playing together and sort of that whole phenomenon of interactive entertainment entered the popular imagination. We didn't have something like that before at this kind of scale. And that was really the symbolism here, right? It wasn't so much about the dollars as much as it was something that connected all of us in a single avenue. I remember Central Park was just mobbed by people making friends, and everybody had a great time, which I think fundamentally is the business that we're in. Over time, we've been very much accustomed, particularly in the games industry, to think of closed platforms. That worked really well, saying we have the box, every 5-6 years we bring out some new content, and it blows the lid off the whole thing. It keeps driving up and up and up. One of the bigger innovations, I believe, in the last 10 years in the industry has been things like Steam. By opening up the platform, by making things accessible, by lowering the barriers to entry, you allow for a lot more innovation to come into the marketplace. Same thing you could say about the app stores. This is a model where, by not scrutinizing or making things too difficult for creatives, you can really extend the life cycle of a lot of products and create a lot more value, both for the supply and the demand side. And then the third thing in my mind that is of note here is that over the last 30 years or so, we've seen a predominant product-based business, right? We go into the store, we buy a disc, and we pop it into our console. That's worked out really well. You see the little peaks there for the Wii. That's a really solid model, and I don't believe that that's going to go away anytime soon. What is different, though, in the last, say, 10, 15 years with the digitalization of the industry is that a lot of value that's created today is coming from very different avenues, very different ways, very different monetization schemas, and so on. So that's where a lot of our attention is. But as we've seen, now that games are much more a mainstream form of entertainment, it allows also to explore indirect consumer revenue, right? What about all those advertisers that are having a hard time relating to younger audiences to traditional things, like, say, sports? Esports is one of those categories where Activision is making a lot of interesting moves, signing some really interesting sponsors that bring evidence to the idea that maybe that could be an indirect consumer revenue as well, which, especially in a high capital-intensive, AAA development cycle is a really nice thing to have. Instead of 2, now you have 3 revenue streams offsetting some of your risk. So those are some of the drivers of change that we see on our end and among our customers. So what then is the future? I think to look into the future, we have to let go of some of the ideas that have served us well, perhaps in the past. But if we're not adjusting, if we're not at least considering some new ideas, we have to really take into consideration where we're going to go next. One of those ideas in my mind is that we love to believe in this sort of individual genius. It's much easier to think, of course, that it's one person who makes this amazing game that everybody loves, but it's always a team. And it's always a team in the context of an organization. And in that organization, there's always a certain discipline. And so while there's been traditionally a lot of sort of animosity between business and creativity, I think what we can do is be a little bit more open to both sides of that conversation. More specifically, in some of the more academic research published recently, what we're seeing is that rather than a homogeneous group of people with roughly the same skill set and same ideas about creativity, what we're seeing is that a heterogeneous approach that has people with different points of view creates a lot more value, not just in terms of how fun a game is, but also in terms of how much money it makes. And if you look back, it's a little bit, it's from the 1800s, but just the same, individuals tend to drive innovation, but they tend to surf on a wave of, creative movements, artistic movements, and so on. So some of these sort of preliminary conclusions indicate that, as it says, artistic movements rather than individual approaches to innovation play a key role. So where does that leave us? Well, there's also things like common sense, right? I think when it comes to big companies trying to turn the tanker as they go, having a lot of licenses and licensors to account to, what you end up doing is sort of trying to run the numbers and seeing the world through a spreadsheet. That obviously didn't work so well in the case of EA and its loot boxes, but they turned it around. They stopped that. They're trying to make good on this. They apologized and overcorrected, which is the right thing to do. Ultimately, of course, in a business where we look at data and intelligence, we have to still respect instinct. We cannot surrender that to just a bunch of number crunching. Another question then is like, well, how do we reach audiences? 10 years ago, it would be magazines. We go on Metacritic, perhaps, and all that. Nowadays, it's sympathetic people with blue hair that drive your business. And that makes a fundamental difference in how you reach your audience, how you extend the life cycle, and so on. Some of the numbers to kind of back that up. Here's this guy, Ninja. He plays with Drake, and it just blows the ceiling off the whole thing. It's a fascinating phenomenon that nobody anticipates, and it's very hard to control. So these are some of the shapes of things to come. Then finally, in my mind, where it really ends up, I'm a fan of Westworld, as it doesn't make, if it wasn't obvious. Companies like Tencent, companies like NetEase, they don't take this in little steps. They buy tons of companies, or at least partially invest in lots of different companies, and then have them sort of, in a Game of Thrones type of way, compete against each other. I was able to meet a few of the CEOs at GDC 2 weeks ago. They have 50, NetEase has 50 studios developing things. It's a brilliant model in that it's, of course, exclusive to them because they're one of the few companies that can afford to do that. At the same time, that's how you create innovation, by putting sort of pressure on the creatives as well as on the business people. So, in a nutshell, I think long term, we're going to be looking for, respect for instinct. We're going to be looking for, a very close and careful curation of, internal cultural values and making sure that creatives and business people together really bring this. If there's anything that I can contribute to this, it would be for both sides of the brain to work nicer together. I look forward to the conversation today. My name is Joost. Thank you for your time.